November 21st, 1944. Palawan-Passage, South China Sea, 2:47 a.m. Commander Reuben Whittaker stands at the periscope of USS Flasher, 60 feet beneath the black water, sweat cooling on the back of his neck despite the chill of the control room. Through the eyepiece he counts shapes on the horizon, lit faintly by a sliver of moon. Tankers, riding low and heavy, their holds full of oil, bound for home islands running dry. Behind him, the plotting party works in near silence, pencils scratching bearings onto acetate. A sonar operator adjusts his headphones and murmurs a correction. Somewhere above, 4 escort vessels weave a protective screen around the convoy, depth charges racked and ready. Whittaker lowers the scope, wipes salt spray from the lens with his sleeve, and gives the order to close the range. Torpedo tubes forward are flooded, outer doors open. The crew of Flasher, 2,400 tons of American steel, built in Groton, Connecticut, and manned by 80 men who have not seen daylight in days, wait for the word. What happens over the following minutes will become one of the most lopsided submarine attacks of the Second World War, and it did not happen by chance. It was the product of 2 years of American code-breaking, torpedo redesign, and a deliberate campaign to strangle Japan's oil supply at sea. By late 1944, Japan's war machine depended on a single fragile artery. The home islands produced almost no petroleum of their own, perhaps 10% of what its military and industry required. Nearly all the oil that fueled Japanese aircraft, warships, and factories travelled by tanker from the captured fields of the Netherlands East Indies, chiefly Balikpapan and Tarakan in Borneo and Palembang in Sumatra, north through the South China Sea to refineries at Yokohama and Tokuyama. This route, roughly 1,800 nautical miles from Borneo to the home islands, became known among American submariners as the Convoy College, because Japanese merchant traffic funneled through a narrow, predictable corridor west of the Philippines called the Palawan-Passage, a stretch of water barely 50 miles wide at its narrowest point, bordered by shallow reefs that forced tankers into a channel submarines could watch and wait upon almost at leisure. By 1944, the United States Navy had broken enough of the Japanese naval codes, principally through the signals intelligence effort known to history as Ultra, to read convoy schedules, routes, and even cargo manifests within days of their transmission. Submarine headquarters at Fremantle in Western Australia and Pearl Harbor further east used these intercepts to position boats like Flasher directly across the paths of tankers before they had even cleared harbour. Patrol orders radioed to submarine commanders often included convoy departure times, accurate to within hours, a level of foreknowledge that transformed submarine warfare from a hunt into something closer to an ambush laid weeks in advance. American submarines had also solved a problem that plagued them for the first 2 years of the war. The unreliable Mark 14 torpedo, prone to running 10 feet deeper than set and to striking a target's hull without detonating at all, a flaw that went uncorrected by the Bureau of Ordnance until mid-1943, despite repeated complaints from patrol commanders. By late 1944, the newer Mark 18 electric torpedo, slower than its steam-powered predecessor at around 29 knots but weightless, allowed a submarine to fire without betraying its position by a visible track of bubbles on the surface, a critical advantage in the moonlit, glass-calm waters of the Palawan-Passage. Flasher, a Gato-class submarine 311 feet long and displacing 2,424 tons submerged, was commissioned in September 1943 at Groton, Connecticut, and had been commanded since April 1944 by 30-year-old Reuben Whittaker, a Naval Academy graduate from Georgia, known among his crew for a calm, methodical approach to attacks that other commanders sometimes conducted with more bravado than patience. Flasher carried 24 torpedoes across her 10 tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, and a crew of roughly 80 officers and men trained relentlessly in night surface attacks, a tactic pioneered by American submariners after 1943 that exploited the low silhouette of a surface submarine against a dark horizon. Japan, by contrast, was losing tankers faster than its shipyards could replace them. Of the roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping Japan possessed in December 1941, submarines alone would eventually account for more than 5 million tons sunk by the war's end, and tankers were the priority target, because without fuel, aircraft could not fly, destroyers could not screen convoys, and battleships could not sortie to meet an American fleet advancing steadily westward across the Pacific. The convoy Flasher found that night in the Palawan-Passage was carrying refined and crude oil south to north, escorted by destroyers and coastal defence vessels, tasked with shepherding it safely to the Formosa Strait and beyond. Whittaker had shadowed the convoy on the surface through the previous evening using Flasher's superior surface speed of over 20 knots to work into a firing position ahead of the tankers rather than trailing behind them, a tactic known as an end-around that allowed American submarines to attack from a position of their choosing rather than pure chance interception. Diving before dawn, Flasher crept to within 1,500 yards of the lead tanker, close enough that Whittaker could make out individual figures on the tanker's deck through the periscope. At 2:52 a.m. he gave the order to fire. 6 torpedoes left Flasher's forward tubes in a fan spread, timed seconds apart, aimed not at one ship, but across the columns of the convoy, so that as the tankers manoeuvred to avoid one strike, they ran directly into the path of another. The first torpedo struck the lead tanker amidships at 2:54 a.m. Witnesses aboard nearby escort vessels later described a column of flame that lit the passage for miles as ignited crude oil erupted through the ship's deck plating. Within 90 seconds, a second detonation tore into a following tanker, its cargo of aviation fuel turning the strike into a fireball that could be seen, according to post-war accounts compiled from Japanese sources, from more than 15 miles away. A third torpedo found its mark against a smaller tanker attempting to turn out of the convoy line, breaking its back and sending it under within minutes. Whittaker, watching through the periscope, ordered Flasher to swing and fire her stern tubes, adding a fourth strike to a second vessel already listing and burning. By 3:01 a.m., roughly 9 minutes after the first fish left the tubes, 3 tankers representing more than 20,000 tons of shipping and their cargoes of tens of thousands of barrels of oil were sinking or ablaze in the passage, and the convoy that had entered the strait as an organised formation was scattering in flame and confusion. If this deep dive into naval history is holding your attention, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these. What followed the initial strikes was chaos rather than an orderly Japanese response. Escort commanders aboard the destroyers and coastal defense vessels screening the convoy, uncertain how many submarines were attacking or from what bearing, ordered depth charge patterns dropped almost at random across a wide arc of ocean, hoping to force Flasher down rather than pinpoint her with any precision. Whittaker took the boat deep, to around 300 feet, well below her officially rated test depth of 300 feet, but a margin American commanders routinely exceeded under fire, and held silent running, engines at dead slow, ventilation fans switched off, the crew moving in stockinged feet to avoid any noise that might carry through the hull to Japanese hydrophones listening above. Over the following 90 minutes, Flasher's crew counted more than 40 depth charges detonating around them, close enough that light bulbs shattered and cork insulation rained down from the overhead piping, close enough that men braced themselves against bulkheads with each concussion, but none close enough to breach the pressure hull. Meanwhile, on the surface, the contrast between the two forces could not have been starker. Where Flasher's crew endured the attack in near total silence, discipline enforced by drilled routine, the Japanese escort crews faced a rescue operation made almost impossible by the very cargo they had been protecting. Burning crude oil spread across the passage in a slick that made it nearly impossible for rescue boats to approach survivors in the water without risking their own hulls catching fire. Post-war Japanese shipping records, incomplete as they are for merchant losses in this period, suggest the crews of the stricken tankers suffered heavy casualties, and that many of the men lost that night were lost, not to the torpedo strikes themselves, but to burns and drowning in the burning slick that followed, a grim inversion of the safety the convoy system was meant to provide. For Japan's war economy, the loss was not merely 3 ships. It was thousands of tons of aviation spirit and crude oil that would never reach the refineries at Tokuyama and Yokkaichi. Fuel that Japanese commanders were already rationing so severely by late 1944 that carrier pilot training hours had been slashed to a fraction of pre-war levels, and the combined fleet's remaining battleships, including the giant Yamato and Musashi, sat largely immobile at anchor in the Linga Roads near Singapore for want of oil to fill their bunkers, closer to the source of crude but denied the refined fuel their engines required. Japanese naval staff officers in Tokyo, reviewing shipping losses through the Second Bureau's intelligence summaries, could see the pattern accelerating month on month, yet possessed neither the escort vessels nor the aircraft to reverse it. Whittaker surfaced Flasher after nightfall to recharge her batteries, drawing air through the open conning tower hatch that tasted, after a full day submerged, cleaner than any the crew could remember, and radioed a contact report to submarine headquarters at Fremantle. It was a routine but essential procedure that allowed other American boats operating nearby, part of the coordinated multi-submarine formations, known informally as wolf packs, that had become standard Pacific tactics by 1944, to be vectored towards the scattered remnants of the convoy. 2 further American submarines, alerted by Whittaker's report, intercepted stragglers from the same convoy over the following 2 days, sinking an additional tanker and a freighter that had become separated while attempting to outrun the original attack. In total, the Palawan-Passage action of November 1944 accounted for the destruction of a significant portion of the very convoy Japan had assembled, specifically to resupply the fleet ahead of the fighting anticipated around the Philippines, where American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had landed at Leyte a month earlier. The turning point for the American submarine force was not a single dramatic realization, but a pattern that commanders like Whittaker now understood with total clarity. Japan's oil lifeline could be severed not by seeking out her battleships and carriers directly, but by strangling the tankers that fed them. Submarine Force Pacific, under Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, began deliberately prioritizing tanker sinkings above all other targets in the war's final year. A policy shift reflected in patrol orders issued from Fremantle and Pearl Harbor through the winter of 1944 into 1945, with commanders explicitly instructed to pass up freighters and troop transports where a tanker presented itself instead. Flasher herself would go on to become, by the war's end, the single highest scoring American submarine of the entire Pacific campaign measured by tonnage sunk, credited with more than 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping destroyed across her wartime patrols, a record earned substantially through actions like the 9-minute attack in the Palawan-Passage. Whittaker's own log entries from the patrol, later studied at the Submarine School in New London, Connecticut, became something close to a textbook example of how patience, intelligence, and timing could be worth more than raw aggression in a night surface attack. In the weeks that followed, the consequences rippled outward from that 9-minute action into every corner of Japan's war effort. Convoys attempting the Borneo to Japan run were forced into wider, slower routes, hugging the Chinese and Indo-Chinese coastlines, adding days to voyages already strained by shortages of escort vessels, since so many destroyers had already been lost defending earlier convoys. Japanese naval planners, drafting operational orders for the coming defense of the Philippines and later Okinawa, found themselves calculating fuel reserves not in months but in weeks. By early 1945, the once mighty combined fleet possessed battleships and carriers with insufficient fuel to conduct even basic training exercises, a paralysis that historians have traced directly to the systematic destruction of the tanker fleet through actions across the South China Sea in the last year of the war. Reuben Whittaker was awarded the Navy Cross for the November Patrol, one of 4 such decorations he would receive during the war, and Flasher herself earned the Presidential Unit Citation. The vessel's hull eventually preserved as a museum ship in Groton, Connecticut, the same yard where she was built, a permanent reminder of 80 men and 9 minutes that helped bring an empire's war machine to a halt for want of fuel. Commander Whittaker would later describe, in post-war interviews with naval historians, the strange quiet that settled over Flasher's control room in the hours after the attack, once the depth charges stopped and the crew allowed themselves to breathe properly for the first time since the periscope had gone up at 2:47 a.m. Somewhere above them, oil still burned on the surface of the Palawan-Passage, a black smear visible from reconnaissance aircraft passing overhead the following morning, spreading and thinning across the water where 3 tankers had gone down. Down in the wardroom, off-duty crewmen ate a cold meal in silence. Tinned meat and bread eaten straight from the tray. the adrenaline of the attack giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee could shift. In the forward torpedo room, men counted the tubes still loaded and began the slow, careful work of reloading spares, hauling each 1,400-pound torpedo along its rails by hand, ready for whatever the following night might bring. Whittaker made his log entry by the dim red light kept throughout the boat to preserve night vision, recording tonnage estimates, torpedo expenditure, 6 fired forward and 2 more from the stern tubes and the bearing on which he had last seen a tanker slip beneath the surface, her bow rising briefly before the sea closed over her. It was a plain procedural entry, the kind logged in submarines up and down the Pacific that autumn, written by a young commander who understood that the true measure of the night's work would not be counted in ships sunk alone, but in the aircraft that would never fly for want of fuel, the battleships that would sit at anchor through the war's final months, and a conflict that, minute by burning minute, in a channel most of the men aboard Flasher could not have located on a map before the war began, was drawing measurably closer to its end. Flasher herself would survive the war, return home to Connecticut, and stand today as a preserved reminder that in the Palawan-Passage, on one November night, 9 minutes changed what an empire could still afford to burn.